In this video tutorial we're going to look at pivots and especially the Tradestation pivot function. So first of all, what is a pivot? And you can see in this chart here I've marked a pivot here, high pivot with a little blue dot, and a pivot essentially means that this price here is higher than this price and this price and this price, and it's also higher than this price and this price and this price, or rather the high of those bars. And with the Tradestation pivot function, you'll also see that in this case the highs of the bars to the left of the pivot can be equal to the high of the pivot. So let's look at the Tradestation pivot function. Now, I use this a lot. There are other ways of finding pivots in Tradestation. This function is not so complex when you get used to it. Let's just go through each of the inputs to the the arguments for this function. So the first argument is the value being looked at. Now it could be high, could be low, could be anything you want to look at, but typically a high or a low when we're looking at charts. The next figure is the number of look-back bars. This means how many bars is the function going to look at on the chart to determine whether a pivot has taken place or not. The next number is the left strength, in this case 3, and that determines how many bars to the left of the pivot have to be less than or greater than it for it to qualify as a pivot. And the next number is the right strength, and in this case it's saying that for the case of a high that 2 bars have got to be less than or equal to, or rather less than the high for it to constitute as a high pivot. Now the next one is the instance. Now it could be that looking back 25 bars there are actually more than one pivot within those 25 bars. So what this number is saying is this is the most recent number 1. If we put 2 in there, it would find the next most recent, 3 the next most recent, and so on. The next figure is the high-low. Now if we're looking for high pivots, this would be set to 1. If we're looking for, in other words, a sort of V upside down shape. If we're looking for low pivots, in other words a V shape, then that would be -1. And then finally we've got these two strange creatures here, the O pivot price and the O pivot bar, and these are actually the result. These are the information that the function returns. This first one is the price of the pivot, and the next one is the number of bars ago that the pivot occurred, and this will make more sense when we look at it on an actual chart. The other thing about this function is it will return a value. So it returns 1 when a pivot is found, and it will return -1 if a pivot is not found. So here I've created a simple show me study, and I've created a couple of inputs, left strength being 3 and right strength being 2, and you'll see if we go down here to the pivot function, you'll see where I've put those inputs into the actual function. Of course you could have just replaced that by putting 3 in there, but using an input means that we can change it when we're running the program. The vars, and this can be a little bit confusing, O pivot price 1 and O pivot bar 1 are actually the values that the function is going to return for us. So if we look at the actual, we've set up a condition here. We said condition 1 is equal to the pivot function is not equal to -1. So the way this works is condition 1 is going to be set to true when there is a pivot found, in other words pivot is not -1, and condition 1 is going to be set to false when this function returns -1. Now in order to plot a point where the pivot occurs, we need to have a couple of things come into play. Firstly, condition 1 is true, a pivot has occurred. Now the soonest that we find out about a pivot point having had occurred is where the right strength is equal to the number of bars ago that the pivot occurred. Now bear in mind that we're never going to know that a pivot has occurred on a specific bar when we're at that bar, because we don't know what the next bar is going to do. So we have to set a certain amount of right strength, and the soonest we're going to know based on a right strength of 2 that a pivot has occurred is when the function tells us a pivot occurred 2 bars ago, in other words equal to our right strength in this case. And when that happens we then plot a dot. Now we also have to be a little bit careful here. We don't plot it at the bar where we discover a pivot has occurred. We actually need to plot it at the bar where the pivot actually did occur. So to do that, we use this function here where we put the little square brackets, and that's telling the plot function to plot the dot O pivot bar 1 bars ago. And not only that, we don't just want to plot the bar, the point at the current high. We need to plot it at the high, what the high was actually at the pivot bar. Of course, in this particular case, we could have used the O pivot price 1, but here I've just said the high that occurred O pivot bar 1 ago. And then the next thing, I just gave it a name, and probably can't see that, just move along there. Gave it a name of pivot, and we set the color to cyan. So let's just quickly look at the chart, and on a 1 minute IBM you can see a number of pivots. Now, one thing to just to note here is if we go to Format and Analysis Techniques, you'll see that I've set the left strength of being 10 and the right strength of 2. So let's just close that. So just to go back to what I was saying a couple of moments ago, the right strength is 2, which means that at this bar, or rather at this bar, we knew that the pivot had occurred. So we then count back to 1, 2, and that is where we draw the dot, and we also draw it at the price that was the high of that particular bar. So one way we could test this is to, if we take our current bar here, which occurred on April 17th, 1600, and we just go and we say, create a little extra part of the program. We say, if the time is equal to 1600 and the date is the 17th of April 2009, and Tradestation has a strange way of writing dates, then print the date, which is obviously going to be this date, the time, which is obviously going to be this time. We're going to print the condition, in other words, has a pivot occurred? And if it has, based of course on the inputs that I just showed you a moment ago, we're then going to print the price, or rather the price, which is here, and the 4 and 2, that just means 4 integers to the left of the point and up to 2 decimal places. And then we're going to print O pivot bar, and that's going to tell us the number of bars ago that the pivot occurred. So let's just go back to the chart, and you'll see, if you look at the bottom of the screen, I've set up the print log, and running this program, you can see, as we said, the date is the 17th times 1600, and let's just see what it tells us. Well, condition 1 is true. Well, yeah, that looks correct, because we're looking back. In fact, how many bars are we looking back? We're looking back 25 bars. So within 25 bars of this bar, you'll see, yes, there is a pivot point there, and it'll say the pivot price is 101.95. So let's just look at the most recent pivot, and the high 101.95. Whoops. So that is correct. And then it's telling us that this bar occurred 12 bars ago. So let's just count. So we don't count this bar, we count the next one. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Oops. So there you can see the pivot is correctly drawn 12 bars ago from the current bar.